happened to me, it was a little difficult for me to think of what I want to talk about today, because there's the whole design piece that I work on, then there's the planning and urban design, and then also a big urban research piece that I've been engaged with since the last 4 years. So what I thought I would do is, since a lot of you are planners, urban designers, and also architects, to give you an overview of this whole idea of child-friendly cities, as well as how the field sort of got shaped, and how does it connect to the larger discussions and discourses on urban planning and sustainable development, etc. So I will also be sharing some of the research that we have recently done with UNICEF in 3 cities, Mumbai, Bhopal and Kolkata. And then I'll share here. And shall I continue or shall we? Okay. So why this sort of sudden interest in the urban and children and all that all over the world, not just here, everywhere? There are some very good reasons for that. The year 2008 was a turning point in the urban history of the world, because for the first time more people started living in cities than in villages. That's why the 21st century is often called the urban century, the century of the cities in many ways. But more important is to know that by this 50% urban population that we have globally today is going to multiply many times. By 2050, more than 70% of the world's urban population will be living in cities. And when you look, where is this urban growth really going to happen? Continents like North America, even Latin America, are all 80%, close to 80% urbanized already. This growth is really going to happen in Asia and Africa, more specifically in some of the poorest regions of Asia and Africa. Who are going to be the biggest contributors to this urban growth? When you look at it country-wise, there is now consensus that says that the biggest per country contribution to the urban growth by 2070 is going to be by China, India, and Nigeria. And all these are countries which already have substantial population pressures. But there is a distinction between the urban growth of China and India. When you look at, this is 2010 figures, in the median age of China's urban population today is 34.2 years, whereas the median age of India's urban population is only 25 years. So what we are seeing in India is a very large youth bulge, what we say, at the population at the base, the bottom, young population, the growth in youngsters in these cities are going to be phenomenal. So in a way, we cannot really ignore the needs of young people in cities anymore, because most of the people who are going to be living in future cities are going to be young people, young families, young children, youth, etc. And they are the ones who are going to, that's why we talk about a demographic dividend of India, because they are going, the drivers of the economy. Most of the lowest paid jobs go to them, the starting jobs, which really drives the economy. So when we talk about this whole, and we have to talk about how do we make, when we talk about make cities better and friendlier for the young people, this kind of thinking, however, is going on for quite a few decades now. It, in a way, started in the 1970s, this urban thinking, but of course thinking about children had been going on since 1924 with the Geneva Convention, then the Declaration of Human Rights in 1949, then of course the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which for the first time brought in the rights of the child to the forefront in all decision making. It's the most ratified UN convention in the history of the world. All countries in the world have ratified it and brought in laws, amended their constitutions, except the United States. They don't believe, because their state laws are often in contradiction with the rights, what's talked about as basic rights of children, because they don't want to give up the primal position that government and parents have control over children. So it contravenes sort of a lot of state laws, and also the death penalty law that exists in many states for minors, like Texas, which is a huge Republican base, as you know. So they will not adopt the rights of the child, because then they have to giving death penalties to children. But aside from that, there are also many, many other movements that have shaped the thinking about children in cities, and also talking about the city as a frame for development of children. Environmental movements, the advocacy planning movements in the 60s, starting with the civil rights movements in the 70s. You know, the discipline of urban design is not very old itself. In 2008, it celebrated 50 years of its founding. There was a convening conference in UPenn. I was one of the panelists on the education panel. It was called Urban Design After the Age of Oil, where they called urban designers, you know, leading thinkers from all over the world. And 50 years ago, there was a similar conference at Penn, again, both funded by Rockefeller Foundation, where people like Jane Jacobs, I.M. Pye, you know, all the greats, Louise Mumford, they had gathered, and that sort of kick-started the founding of the discipline of urban design. The first course started at Harvard, followed by Penn, etc., etc. A lot of the books were being written in the 60s, you know, your Jane Jacobs, Death and Life of Great American Cities, Louise Mumford's The City in History, all these phenomenal texts which are today still as relevant in many ways. But there was also from the 70s, 80s, particularly 90s onwards, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there was a growing sense of international environmentalism, that a lot of very, very significant things happened. I'll just come back to that, but before that I want to talk about a very important project that was conceived by Kevin Lynch. Many of you know him. He was a visionary urban designer, particularly those of you who have studied urban design know of his many books. He was a professor at MIT, and he used to do this exercise with his students every time he would come into a class. He would ask them to do the cognitive maps of their neighborhoods when they were growing up. And through that, he sort of accumulated this whole layer of understanding of what has shaped, how places have shaped the trajectory of students from where they were to where they have come. So this interest led him to creating this project called Growing Up in Cities in the 70s, which was supported by UNESCO. It happened in 8 countries at that time, common methodology, working with adolescents in cities, particularly in areas of cities which are slightly deprived, at risk, etc., etc. Then this project was revived in the mid-90s by Louis Chawla of University of Colorado, and the sites increased from 8 countries, it became 12 countries. In fact, there was a site in Bangalore, in Satyanagar. There was a case study, a Growing Up in Cities project in Bangalore in the late 90s. So all these movements were happening from the design and planning side of it. But of course, if you look at it, this whole idea of the child-friendly city, I have to tell you that this concept of CFC, it's a very UN concept, this thing, the child-friendly city. There was a movement that happened. It's almost like a little mountain stream. It sort of gurgles down, picks up pace sometimes, then goes underground, again finds a little crevice, comes out here, there, etc., like that. But the decade of 90s was very important for children globally. We had the almost universal ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1990. Then there was this big movement of mayors, defenders of children, again, in around that same time, because we say it's the local government who is closest to children in their everyday lives. And so mayors, unlike in our cities, in most other global cities, mayors are very powerful people. You may have heard of Enrique Peñalosa, who was a very celebrated mayor of Bogota. He keeps going in and out of power. He's again mayor. And he's done amazing stuff for the city of Bogota. And he always used to talk about the lowest denominator, we have to design for the child. So he totally revamped school districts, did a lot for open spaces, for amazing transit systems, pedestrianization, the Ciclovia weeks which started, which sort of shut down swaths of main boulevards and city streets, which then took off all over. Our Ragiri Day, which is happening in a lot of cities right now, is actually an idea that's taken from there. So all these movements. Then, of course, there were some legendary UN conferences on environment. In the 1992, we had the Earth Summit at Rio, and then we had 1996. From Rio came the Agenda 21, which is a local government agenda for how do we promote better cities for children. Then, of course, the second Habitat Conference 1996, which was in Istanbul. Habitat conferences happen once in 20 years. They're done by UN Habitat. All the UN bodies and governments participate, and they set the urban agenda for the next 20 years. So the first Montreal, that was 1976 and 1996, and the last one happened in Quito in Ecuador in 2016. I'll come back to that. So then there was in 2002 UN Special Assembly on children. For the first time, the entire UN body, comprising of all its different organizations, departments, every few years they do these general assemblies and they decide to focus on a topic. In 2002 it was on child, and I was very privileged to have worked as part of that movement. I was working with an organization called Housing and Land Rights Network, Habitat International Coalition, and we were working with a lot of groups at that time on preventing forced evictions of slums, and we were also working with a lot of refugees in Southeast Asia and South Asia. So we were, that girl in the picture is Bhutanese refugee who was living in the refugee camps on the borders of Nepal and Bhutan, stateless. She was a very, very vocal child. So we took her to the General Assembly and she spoke to the UN at that point. And what she talked about was about the kind of deprivations, the kind of environment they're living in. The refugee camps that governments put up, and what we are seeing with the Rohingyas and the Syrian refugee camps all over, they're absolutely inhuman environments. And imagine, this girl has grown up in that camp. She has not known anything else outside that camp in her whole life. And one of the things that she used to talk about is there was a river nearby, and the only sort of experience which she had where she felt that she was finding herself was when she would go and wash the utensils in the water in the morning, and touching that water and no one else, that sense of peace that comes over her. That connection with nature that children have. And later, we have done a lot of work in the last 2 years with refugee children across 6 countries. And it came up again and again as a theme, particularly when you're living in situations of crisis, under very difficult situations, the importance of natural environments for children's lives. Then, of course, the UN came up with the World Fit for Children document, which often is sort of like a seminal document for talking about how to shape cities, etc., for children. But what was very clear by the end of this decade of activism and international policy making is that we cannot ignore the child anymore. And we have to plan for and with the child, not only for the child, but with the child. Children have to be stakeholders, and children have a lot to teach us. So this whole call for participatory processes with children started getting traction. In fact, I did my PhD in a department which actually, the thing was, my focus of the PhD was environmental and community participation. So we were actually taught how to work with end stakeholders to create plans from cities to, any scale in the urban realm. I don't know what has happened to that. It's the font thing. Anyway. So here, what we have talked about so far, the main actor in this perspective of the child-friendly city are the producers of that city. In a way, people who hold the knowledge, people who have political power, people who have the ideals, the budgets, etc. So in a way, the whole UN child-friendly city movement is very top-down. It talks about responsibilities of governments. It talks about responsibilities of private players, the civil society, NGOs, CBOs, etc. And it is totally anchored in child rights. It is anchored in developmental theories. It is anchored in ideas of social justice and sustainability discourses, the Earth Summit and all that, the Habitat conferences that came into the fore. So in this way, when you unpack it, and I had also worked with UNICEF in Jordan, where in 2007, the MENA region, which is Middle East and North Africa region, they were piloting this whole concept of child-friendly cities in 19 cities across. So we wrote the policy document. A group of international writers were called to Amman, and the Queen Rania of Amman is a very child-friendly person. She really believes in children's rights. Very, very progressive mayors of the city of Amman who are very child-friendly mayors, etc. So when we thrashed out these ideas for the government, the things that came out were that a child-friendly city guarantees certain things which we also talk about as non-negotiables, that the young people should be able, and their issues should be able to influence decisions about their city. They should be able to express their opinions on the city that they want. This is all part of that whole participatory movement. Participate in family, community, and social life. You have to create opportunities for that. Receive basic services such as healthcare, education, housing, shelter, etc. Drink safe water and have access to proper sanitation, which is all the mantra of a lot of our flagship urban missions today. But these thinkings were happening in the 90s. Be protected from exploitation, violence, and abuse. And this is so endemic in our cities today. When you look at the NCRB crime ratings, Delhi is the top city for crimes against children. 39.4% of all crimes committed in the city of Delhi are against children. So it's no wonder that every day we shudder to open the newspaper to see how many more rapes have happened today. And 3-year-olds, 11-month-olds, it's like just gets worse and worse. And many of those are because of the kind of environments they're living in, this absolutely degradable slum environments and other peripheral urban areas that they're living in. Walk safely in the streets on their own. Meet friends and play. Play is a basic right of the child. Very few people know that. It's one of the rights in the convention. Have green spaces for plants and animals. Live in an unpolluted environment. Participate in cultural and social events. Be an equal citizen in their city. And have access to service regardless of their ethnic origin, religion, gender, or disparity. Like in India today and in many other countries, government cannot deny you education if you are a refugee or a migrant from another state, but they are denied those services. It's almost impossible to get a child admitted into a school if they don't have a proof of stay or a housing document or something that links them to a habitat. Now, for new migrants in cities who are living mostly in unauthorized settlements in peripheral areas, that is a huge challenge. And those children are much more vulnerable than some of the poorest children living in slums because they, in a way, become stateless. Now, let's talk about, there is a lot of misconceptions about what is a child-friendly city and what it is not. So, first and foremost, it is not a project or a program at all. We talk about it as an approach that makes all government structures work for children. We call commissioners of children or ombudspersons for children. Their job, they sit within the local government. Their job is to ensure that the budgetary allocations of all departments, when they are made, are not made in a way that is going to violate children's rights, or that every department allocates something for promoting the rights of the child from that lens, whether it's from health, whether it's from education, whether it's from housing, whether it's parks and recreation, etc. So there are these structures like that. In Kerala, for example, there were through the JNURM, there was a proposal for creating a child-friendly municipal corporation, and a lot of these ideas were talked about, of a child-friendly commissioner for the city, etc. But it hasn't happened. It is certainly not a government program. It is a process of governance, and there is a difference between a government program and a governance process. And it is not a sector relying on specialized knowledge. It involves and integrates all. Like, for example, I'll show you later, when we are working with the city of Calcutta, the municipal corporation is a partner, the Ministry of Women and Child Development is a partner in this, and we did this. They told us we want to create a safe and inclusive city for adolescents in Kolkata. So you tell us, let's do a situation analysis of one ward and see what's working and what's not working for children. And you tell us what we can do better, what kind of processes we need to put in place, so that next generation of adolescents growing up are healthier, better educated, better skilled, and can have a better life as adults. So, and it also does not require substantial funding, because funding is going to come from all departments, from allocated projects. You just have to adopt the child lens for doing it. And it is not also a time-bound thing. It is something that we say that governments should do irrespective of any project timeline or anything. For example, we are today talking about disability, which is mainstreamed in all our city master plans. We are talking about disaster resilience. We are also talking about gender to some extent, but child-friendly, no. So climate, some talk, but no, not really. It's also not so much reliant on technical expertise as also a cultural and ethical movement for children. And it has to be a child-led process. You have to create platforms for children, whether it's children's clubs, whether it's allowing them to come to the ward level committees, etc., the ward committees having representation of children and youth, so that their voice can be heard. Again, the Kerala example is good, because the example of the Bal Sabhas at the neighborhood level, which then gets collectivized at the area level, then the ward level, to the municipal level, similar to the women's movement, they have created the structure for children as well. Now, the last thing in this, the latest piece in this is we were working in the development world, the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015. Now, the post-2015 era, we have adopted, the world has adopted Sustainable Development Goals. And it's encompassive. It has got, it covers just about every facet of life, every sector, etc. But there are Goal 11 is the urban goal. It talks about human settlements. But part of that, as I spoke about the Habitat 2 conference in Ecuador, Quito, the third conference, the new urban agenda was adopted, which is about implementing the sustainable development goals in the context of cities. And it very, very clearly says, the Goal 11 particularly talks about making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, right? It also, but then there are other concurrent goals of ending poverty in all its forms, talking about security of tenure, how do we upgrade slums, etc., ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages, ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. These are all urban goals that the world, every government has ratified. Ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education, promoting lifelong learning opportunities, etc. Achieving gender equality and empower all women and girls. So the sustainable urban development for social inclusion, ending poverty, that is sort of the mantra of the new urban development agenda. And we also talk about prosperity for all, but in that we have to be very cautious unless we are specifically focusing on children. This idea that if we have a top-down policy, if boats start getting lifted, children automatically benefit is not always true. And we have seen that in scheme after scheme after scheme, government scheme. Because it's the trickle-down effect, the trickle ends so quickly up there, it doesn't really come down to the level of the child. And also environmentally sustainable and resilient urban development. And all this is for all this, there is a very strong call for action for participatory and people-centered approaches. So now I come to the other end of the spectrum. Who are the users? The bottom. The bottom is where we are talking about children and youth. And now the world is saying we need to engage with them, we need to respect them as individuals, as rights-bearing individuals, and it should be part of their learning process, and we should also learn from them, their needs, what are the issues. And we have to talk about things which are typically thrown out of the window as frivolous and time waste, like play, recreation, interactions with peers, exploration of the urban environment, just masti karna, things like that, which we just totally throw out of the window as totally inconsequential. They're absolutely fundamental to a child's development, and we have to provide for those things. And when you look at the world from a child's viewpoint, it looks very, very different. And depending upon the age, but for the youngest children, everything is a barrier. Most things are a barrier for them, what is very, very easy for us. So how do we break down those barriers is a big problem. So a lot of people had been talking about, this is a very dear colleague of mine in Aalto University in Finland, Marketa Kita. Her dissertation, she proposed, her PhD dissertation, this model called the Bullerbee model, where we talked about that the two most important variables for planning for children are independent mobility and actualizing affordances. Affordances are opportunities in the environment which we see and we act upon. Like, for example, if I see the chair, I would want to go and sit here. But if a 3-year-old comes, he or she will probably want to sit under the chair. So each person, the environment affords different things. How we act upon them is very, very dependent upon our own psychology and our need at that point, and how we are perceiving that at that moment. It's a cognitive thing as well. Perceptual psychology plays a very, very important role in this. So her model, that an environment which has very high independent mobility for children, as well as very high affordances that they can freely actualize without constraints, which we call the Bullerbee model, is an ideal environment for children. Then, of course, you can't see any of this, but this is talking about my own PhD dissertation on child-friendly cities. It was called Children's Friendship with Place, and looking at understanding the city bottom-up from a place-based model. And I talked about, and this whole literature, I deconstructed the idea of friendship and what it means if we translate it. Can an environment or a place become a friend of a child? What does it take to do that? And so it was a very, very strong theoretical approach, and then I did a lot of empirical work, and I came up with 4 things: that child-friendly places are places in children's environments, that places that children care for, places that children learn from, places that children can be very active freely without any kind of too much judgment or constraint, and of course places that children can have secrets in. It's very, very important, the need for privacy. So my work was in the Nizamuddin Basti in Delhi, and I pretty much lived there for a year and documented spaces, shared spaces, how the children were interacting and playing in them. A lot of behavior mapping at different times, different days of the week, different seasons, etc. And none of these places had a single play equipment in them. But some of them were very, very friendly places because children had free mobility. Most of it was pedestrian, the core of the village. It's an urban village surrounded by very high real estate of Delhi. It had lots of loose paths for children to manipulate, create play territories, etc. Like they could go and freely draw on a wall. Someone would come and, wash it. They had access to friends. They can go easily to anybody's house and not be the whole cultural and social capital that we talk about. So it was a very poor community. Mostly poor Muslims who were living there, nothing from the state. And of course the dargah, the social capital, nobody ever goes to bed hungry in that place because they take care of the community. The poorest of the poor are fed, they're given clothes, they're given warm blankets, etc. So for poor children, and my hypothesis was that this community and these children, there were a lot of orphans living there as well, and they were thriving. You will not know, they don't have families. They can just go in any house and sleep at night. Their friends, and they had a school that they went to. That none of these children will survive outside of this community. So what makes this community so embracing of children? And how do we understand those values and create those spaces? There were a lot of lessons for me also in terms of how a shared space and inclusive public space works. It doesn't mean every child has to play with everyone else. No, not at all. Let them cohabit the space. They will fall into groups. They will find their own spaces. But how do you, through design, let that happen? And there were tremendous design learning from me from this exercise. I'm not going to go into it today. Main actors and their perspectives. So we have talked about the producers. We have talked about the users. But is that all it takes to create child-friendly cities? I think not. There's a very important group here, the regulators. The government may give you great policies, may even, give you spaces, children can use those spaces, but children will not be able to use those spaces if their parents don't allow them to go out, or their teachers don't allow them to go out, or anybody who's in a caretaking, caregiving, custodian position do not allow them to go out. And there are many reasons. They're scared of the traffic. They're scared of the social rules. Like in Nizamuddin Basti, girls had different rules to play by, boys had different rules. Then there was also this whole thing of scary thing of child protection that we see everywhere. So, in a way, for me, a child-friendly city brings these three actors together: the producers, the regulators, and the users. And you have to, in a way, invite them and make them partners in development. Let them talk to each other, share their perspectives, understand the issues from their each perspective to come to, like when I was doing my PhD dissertation, I was like all about only children's perspective. Then when I became a mother, I started understanding the perspective of the regulators. Then I started working with cities and government. I started understanding the perspectives of government better. What are the imperatives? What are the challenges they face? So the thing is dialogue. How do we bring stakeholders on one table and talk about it, different groups? And how do we support each group, to do what's right for children? I'm going to now talk about the program that we did in Mumbai, Bhopal, and Kolkata. It was called Promoting Safe Communities for Mumbai and Bhopal, and for Kolkata, it's called Safe and Inclusive City for Children. It was really an action research project. The whole idea of a safe community as we defined it was to reduce risks in children's lives and build their resilience. So it was a mapping exercise primarily. We wanted to map the risks and vulnerabilities of urban children from primarily protection and safety concerns, but we then looked at it from the lens of everything: health, education, play and recreation, because everything is a protection issue in a way. So we worked in 3 slums in Mumbai, 6 slums in Bhopal, and 19 slum pockets in one entire ward in Kolkata. In Mumbai, our slums were spread in 2 wards, 2 marginal wards, M East, R North. In Bhopal, it was spread in 5 wards. So this is the map. We reached a population of 20,000 in Bhopal, almost 82,000 in Mumbai, because they're very, very large slums, and about 8,000 in Kolkata. That gives you the idea of the wards in Bhopal. They're mostly inner city wards because the poor people in Bhopal, because of the topography, live in the center. In Bombay, they are spread out extremely external to the city. And in Kolkata, it's a very central ward, North Calcutta, as we say. Very settled area. But very interestingly, when we did the scoping here, we first identified the vulnerability pockets. And what was very interesting, the ward, even though it's one, it actually functions as 2 wards because there's a major city-level artery that sort of bisects it, Chittaranjan Avenue, that's a metro corridor. And so the east side and west side. And very interestingly, the west side of the ward was far more vulnerable. You'll see that huge brown swath in the middle. That's because it has a very it houses new migrants a lot, and there's a interesting system. Most of them are actually non-Bengali. On the east side, the vulnerability pockets are all poor Bengalis, but they're in a way assimilated because of language, and there's very little difference between a middle class house and what we consider a slum house somewhere. And they're not really slums. There may be a house, very old house, falling apart. We even found one house, there were 80 people staying in there, and they had these big rooms, and they had created these bunk beds, 6 3-tier bunks, so each family gets a bunk to live on, and they take permission from the councillor to put up a bunk, because the structure is also an endangered structure. And there also, now Calcutta Municipal Corporation has started this thing of going and tagging dangerous buildings. So many buildings are tagged dangerous. Once a building is tagged dangerous, they have to leave, because they seal the building because it's considered environmentally unsafe. But whereas in the west side, it's very, very profession based. For example, this area is called Lohapatti, and these are all blacksmiths who are just sitting there and making iron products. And it's very interesting, they make these huge drums, they sit inside the drums and make them, and there are families staying there, children growing up there. There's a very big red light area right on the extreme corner of that big brown thing over here. This is a red light area, the Lohapatti area is here. But also there's a very big open space. It's a park, it's a designed park. But the kids of this neighborhood, because of their identity of being migrants, they're Biharis, they are Odias, they are some from Gujarat, very surprisingly, and from other states of India as well. They speak a different language. So when we talk about access to basic services, this is a ward which otherwise has many, many schools, many government schools and stuff like that. But they're all in Bengali medium. So these kids can't study there. Language becomes a barrier. So barrier is not only physical. So in one of our proposals to the government, we talked about starting shifts of the school in Hindi. Otherwise these kids won't have right to education over here. And their parents are so poor, they cannot give them private tuitions in Bengali to cope up, though private tuitions are very, very common. This is in Bhopal. So the thematic areas that we explored were safety and security, protection, environment, education, health, play and recreation, and participation and empowerment, understanding what are the platforms available for people's participation. So we did extensive household surveys. In Mumbai and Bhopal, we trained children and adolescents as researchers, along with community members. They collected the data. There was NGO support. In Kolkata, it was college students, mostly adolescents, 18, 19-year-olds who collected the data. Then we had these other tools which were much more child-friendly. We had these observation checklists. So we would give children these checklists to go into houses and document housing quality. What is happening. So that's something that we couldn't go in, and a lot of professional researchers can't really go in, because you would be looked upon very suspiciously. But they are part of the community. They brought in such fantastic data in terms of what kind of there was beds like this. There's a fire under the bed. The kitchen is under the bed. This high, the woman goes under the bed to cook. So you have dangerous practices like that even now, and the room itself is like 6 feet wide. So the entire thing is a bed, and there's no other space, like 2 feet of space in front, and there's 6 people staying there. So after cooking is done, the kitchen will be cleared, someone else will go in to sleep there. So there's all these layers of habitability issues that started coming out. We also took children, they did safe and unsafe space mapping, they went on transect walks, we documented that, then we integrated all that data in GIS, what are the reasons for considering spaces safe and unsafe, etc. GPS devices to do that, we trained the adolescents. So a lot of fantastic real-time data which the corporation is going to use now. These are some of the habitability matrices that we did. This is from Mumbai, M East Ward. So one of our things was a resettlement site of Lalubhai compound, very, very unfamous in many ways. But what we found that only 34% of houses in Mumbai slums, other than of course Lalubhai, which is a flat, had toilets. And in some of the slums, like Shivaji Nagar, which is in our north, it's a third generation slum. There were even government servants living in that slum. So children were getting educated and all that. Everything is fine. There's no sanitation at all. There's just one bank of public toilets. And when you look at it, the population of the slum, I think I may have that slide. Yeah, so there was an overall gap of 91% of toilets in Mumbai, and in these kind of places, Shivaji Nagar, the one toilet seat to user ratio, guess how much? I mean, normally what is the standard that you use for a toilet in a school or a college? 1:30. In a public toilet, in a slum, or when the government goes and makes these public toilet banks in a slum, not the Sulabh Sauchalayas where anybody can walk in, but within a slum where there are a certain number of households, etc. There is a World Bank standard of 1:50. 1:25 is considered decent, but in very high density areas they say 1:50. In Shivaji Nagar, we found the one toilet seat to user is 1:595. So do you think children get a chance to go into the toilet? They don't. The women, do you think, use the toilet? They don't. So open defecation is rampant. They will seek out any space outside in the dark or early in the morning to go and relieve themselves. This is happening in the heart of Mumbai. And this is a very good slum, I'm telling you. The third generation slum, they were educated, their median income was not bad, but this was happening. Garbage hardly, like in Lalubhai compound, it's a designed space, and there are lots of open spaces in the middle. When you look at it as an urban design plan, you say, बहुत अच्छा बनाया, architect ने इतना open space दे दिया. You know, there's 80,000 people living in that area, in that compound. So these buildings are 8-storied. The lifts don't work. So beyond the second or third floor, when people go up, nobody is going to come down. There's the garbage collection. There's something called a Dattak Basti Yojana, where each family pays, and there's a poor woman who comes with a drum and picks it up from below. Everybody is throwing down their garbage from top. So the open spaces are just filled with garbage. The back lanes, which are dark, narrow alleys, filled with garbage. Expectancy in Lalubhai compound, because of these living conditions, is 39 years. And this is a government-funded World Bank-funded resettlement housing for the poor. And Delhi is following the same model for our slum redevelopments. We are putting them in these 8-story, 10-story, 12-story blocks. And now with the new development plan of Mumbai coming, there are talks of actually rebuilding them as 20-story blocks. And we also found there's a difference in maintenance in the buildings that had got what they call a residence association forum, because they manage it better, and that was one of the criteria of the World Bank when they handed over the project to the government, saying that you must form these residence welfare associations for each building, and you have to give them a maintenance cost for, paying cleaning and lift and all that, lighting, outdoor lighting, etc. So there were 28 buildings. So these housing societies had been formed in only 8 buildings after 10-15 years. And of course, the conditions also show because of that. And lifts only work in those 8 buildings, nowhere else. Old people are getting stuck. There's a huge water problem. Even though there are tanks, there's no water pressure upstairs. So parallel economy has started. They're paying youngsters money to carry water up 8 floors. So these are all design issues which we need to think through. But these design issues cannot be solved without understanding the governance process and without showcasing what happens when you come up with solutions like this. The solution may have been good. Those beautiful drawings and the spaces, green spaces in the middle look beautiful. But why is it that they don't work? I mean, that's why, the whole advocacy planning movement started in the 60s, that how are planners failing the city? It's not their fault. But we actually have very little power in a way. Because we may have great ideas of design and planning, but unless you work with the government and make them understand how this is going to work and what are the systems you need to put in place to make it work, design is always failing people, which is why the Pruitt-Igoe projects of the public housing were dynamited.
Is a pointer.
Okay. Yeah. This way? Okay. Minoru Yamasaki's award-winning project, for which he won the top gold medal from the American Institute of Architects and RIBA. People dynamited that project because it didn't work. It was exactly like these environments we have in Lalubhai compound of public housing. These slab blocks of flats, vandalized, dark, no thought about how it's going to be maintained. So there is a very strong connection between these ideas. Of course, when you talk about security of tenure, which is the basic thing for giving secure housing to anyone, we found a very interesting thing. In slums which had a lot of unauthorized settlements, people reported very high security of tenure, 84% said. But when we asked them to say, what is your proof of stay or what is the proof of the security, they didn't have the documents. Maybe 70% had. This is in the good slums. So there's a very direct correlation between when people make their own huts in a slum and immediately thinking, I'm the owner of this hut. It may be totally in an illegal land, in violation of the land use. It's not recognized, it's an encroachment, but in their mind, it's their home. So this whole idea of security of tenure is a very, very tricky terrain, and it needs to be really thought about differently, that how do we promote group forms of tenure for particularly new migrants, etc., who may not have any other proof of identity, to do that. In Kolkata, it's an old ward, only 42% owned houses, but 94% said we have proof of stay, we are the owners of this house. How is it possible? They're living in a rented house. It's another thing you can't, it's a very tenant-friendly law, you can't evict them, but it's a reality of our cities. Water supply, times are very limited, a lot of conflicts over it. Children miss school, get late for school, then there's whole repercussion of punishments, etc. Because, parents have to go out to work. They are the ones collecting water, particularly the adolescent girls. So it's, again, a cycle. In Kolkata, very interestingly, it's in settled slum pockets, etc., and very, very good counsellor who gives them whatever they ask. So there's actually an overabundance of services we found. Here they have a lot of, because the houses, like I said, are 6 feet by 4 feet, 6 feet by 6 feet, all less than 100 square feet homes. There's no space to put in toilets, so he's gone and built a lot of community toilets. Lots of community toilets, not so much public toilet, but each toilet is shared by 8 to 10 families, and they are supposed to keep it clean, they're supposed to look at. But there is no water supply inside. They have to still get the water, and here you have these standpipes where there's 24/7 Ganga water coming. And the water is just ऐसे नाली में जा रहा है constantly. You can't stop it. It's Ganga water is flowing 24 hours. So they go and get it. Now, he's given anybody can come and ask for a street light. क्या करते हैं वो street light? They go and put it on the wall of their hut outside. It's such an overabundance of street lights. At night they have to shut it down because of the glare. They can't sleep. So it totally defeats the purpose of a street light. At night, when you need light, because there's so many lights, they had to shut it out. But Inside community toilets, there are no lights. So, these are issues that we may not think that they are directly design issues. So, the girls won't go to toilet at night, which then leads to huge amounts of, urinary tract infections and other issues, declining health, etc. So these are all things that, we really need to talk about as designers as well. When we talk about, the whole discipline of urban planning was founded to improve people's health. It was to improve public health of communities, because there was this whole cholera outbreak which happened, and they traced it down to one water point. This is in Scotland. And then this whole idea of public sanitation and the movement and the need for planning happened. Here in India today, we are still living in conditions which are pre-industrial in many ways. And so when the kind of open defecation that's happening in the heart of our cities because of these conditions of public toilets, lack of light, lack of water, lack of adequate toilets, you can imagine the kind of epidemics that when they break out every year, the dengue scare, malaria, this, that, it spreads. And it's even when they get cured, they go to a hospital, they're thrown back, particularly a child in the same environment. India has the world's highest number of stunted children, malnutrition and stunting. And stunting is directly related to bad sanitation in the community. And World Bank has done some estimates of exactly how much GDP loss we actually do every year because of stunting in our children, who cannot cope up later in school, School dropouts happen a lot because many reasons, but stunting is also one of them, and bad health. And of course, then they are not fit to join the workforce, and their longevity is reduced, and there's this whole life cycle burden of disease which doesn't leave them. There's also a huge issue of substance abuse in all these slums. These children and young people have nowhere to go. There are no safe spaces. Parks are taken over by drug addicts, men playing cards, etc. So what do they do? What do they learn? So it's also a way to be zoned out of their reality. 90%, 80% of the kids we worked with were into substances. If not hard, but at least from age 5, they're learning to smoke. And even using drugs in many cases. And if nothing, just the sniffing bit, In Mumbai, it's like of a different level. In fact, we actually had a very famous child psychologist who works with all this come and explain. He brought the drugs and showed it to us. That if you're working with them, you need to know what your customers are using. And he actually showed us there are certain things that they call meow or whatever. That if your kids are addicted to this, at this age, 16, maximum they'll live 18, 19, 21. Not beyond that. You cannot bring them back. You cannot de-addict someone who gets into this drug. There are no de-addiction centers in our planning, in the plans that we make at the ward level or anywhere. The whole city of Mumbai has maybe 2 to 3 government-run centers. No one knows where they are. So these are basic issues of planning. Is not only about providing schools and parks, but there are all these issues of safety that we need to talk about to keep our young people safer. Mental health, huge issue, the kind of stress you're living in. We were actually quite shocked, frankly, with the violence data. In all the cities, we found, of course, there are plethora of unsafe spaces, but the thing with a neighborhood unsafe space and your home being unsafe are very different. Because a neighborhood unsafe space can be both safe and unsafe depending upon the time of the day, depending upon who you are going out with. But with your home, it's not the same. In pretty much every city, we found domestic violence is very high, the stressful environments you're living in, and the domestic violence translates into violence on children. It need not be sexual, but harsh beatings. We found children in Bhopal with broken limbs and all. Their parents, particularly drunken fathers, had beaten them with iron rods. Hand is permanently gone, amputee. A child was hung by his father from the fan. He was saved in the nick of time by a neighbor. And then, of course, we were just shocked shocked by the violence in home data. Same with, and of course on adolescent girls, and a lot of them, relatives keep moving in, a lot of houses don't have doors, strangers come in. In some of the most difficult slums in Bhopal that we worked in, the rag picking community, these adolescent girls, rape is not reported in these communities. They get raped every night. They go to the garbage dump to collect. They said the safest place for us on earth is on top of the garbage dump. No one can touch me there. It's my space. So we are looking at an India which is very different from the India that we see in the advertisements and stuff. This is happening. 70, 80, 90% of our cities are living in these conditions. So when we talk about planning, we also, how do we as planners, as designers, engage with these issues? A lot of these slums which had some respite for children had child resource centers working in them, a safe space where children can come, they can learn, they can spend some time. And we're also saying that start play programs, play schemes, try and create a safe space next to an open space, not a park, but an open space which for some time when the children are there will be safe. There'll be adults, protecting children from harm. So there are many ways of addressing some of these issues. I mean, Kolkata, 90%, more than 90% of the kids thought of the home as the most unsafe space on earth. And mind you, again, it's not sexual abuse, very few cases, again, unreported, but just the sheer, not only physical beatings and abuse, but also a lot of it is mental abuse and torture, name calling, the use of abusive language, and the mental stress and the violence, that whole cycle that it perpetuates, And then they go out and do the same to their friends outside, because that's the language, that's the treatment they're receiving at home. So, and of course, there are other protection issues, unsafe environments being, of course, a big one for us, for planners and designers. How do we create safer homes? How do we, through all these flagship projects that's happening, whether it's PMA or Pele, it was BSUP and all that, how do we create a safer, child-friendly home within that 250 square feet? And it's not just home. How do we create safe common spaces for children? Which is far more important in poor communities than the home, because the home is small, it's crowded. Children will run out to play. How do we protect them when they do that? And even now, 39-40% of the adolescents in Kolkata were married by the age of 14 in the heart of Kolkata, and that's where the minister lives, in the same ward. So, and then of course there are other issues that happen. Child labor hidden and on your face in Bhopal. Every child we worked with was a child laborer, working in extremely harsh conditions. So they may or may not attend school, but they have to work. But it's not reported. It's not reported, a lot of these things. So we also did this whole spatial mapping, which the photographs which I showed before of safe and unsafe spaces. And very clearly, when we did the whole analysis of what is it that makes spaces safe for children, they are talking about places which have presence of trusted and familiar adults. So a lot of schools, a lot of these child resource centers or activity centers, sometimes the tuition centers, etc., where they know they can meet a friend, where they can meet an adult that they trust other than the home, is very, very important. So the importance of children's services and a lot of parenting programs that we are now recommending, etc., are important. Learning opportunity with peers is very important, because also school is sometimes the only space where they have a safe play space, where they can hang out with their peers, and hanging out with friends. These are some of the things that came up again and again, city after city. Of course, what are unsafe spaces? You have environmental hazards, whether it's stray dog problem, garbage dump, deep nala, open railway track, etc., no playground, social hazards of eve teasing, alcoholism, gambling, drug abuse openly. All these are things that children reported as things that make places unsafe. Some of them also talked about sacred places, like if there's a temple in the heart of the community where there's a lot of people around, or the mosque where they meet other people. these are places they talked about as safe spaces, not so much because of the religious thing, but it's also because where they come in contact with a lot of other people, you know, who are loving towards them or show affection towards them. Yeah, the same issues, harsh disciplining at schools. Schools also came up as very, very unsafe spaces. So we then actually created a lot of indicators for a safe community, the model, and at the level of the child, at the level of the household or the family, and also at the level of the city. And using these thematic areas, and we also benchmark the targets to what's benchmarks within the Sustainable Development Goals, within the New Urban Agenda, within our own National Plan of Action for Children, as well as whatever relevant current documents on children exist, both internationally that India has ratified as well as nationally. And then we of course gave a lot of the recommendations for parents are about parenting programs. How do you do positive parenting even when you're living in very harsh situations? And how do you create peer-to-peer support groups for parents, between teachers and parents? Because there are many structures, but are they really working is what we have to understand. For children also, I have to say that all this material is up on our website. This report is up, these posters are up, so you can actually browse them. You can look at them at your own pace. And of course, things for collective action, what the community can do themselves. So there are a lot of ideas. A lot of this is now being fed into, for example, the suburban district of Mumbai is preparing a district child protection plan. So a lot of these recommendations are going into the district child protection plan for suburban Mumbai. For Kolkata, we are creating a adolescent policy for the city, which a lot of these findings are feeding into. In fact, the minister is going to be releasing our report next month in Kolkata. So yes, so that's part one of my presentation. Let's have a quick round of interaction, questions, whatever, and then I'll show you, change tracks and show you something much more design and urban design oriented on right to play.
We were talking about promoting the safe communities. These are measures taken collectively to improve the area. So
yeah, slum in some cases, the slum in some cases the ward.
Okay. So what are the urban planning perspectives in this?
See, in the ward level, when you're working at a ward level, it's easier because when you're working with a budget, wards have budgets. Planning, that's an interesting question. In our country, the planning hierarchy does not match the governance